welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden visits Turkey to discuss Ankara's request to extradite an exiled Turkish cleric and to mend relations in the face of growing Turkey-Russia ties. Will Washington and Ankara overcome their differences? And we speak with the Chief of Staff to Canadian leader Justin Trudeau's Katie Telford on Prime Minister's hopes for his country ahead of his trip to China for the G20 summit next month. And we begin today's program with the U.S.-Turkey ties. U.S. Vice President Joseph Biden has arrived in Turkey for critical talks with the country's leadership. He's the highest-ranking Western official to visit Turkey since the failed July the 15th coup. Biden's mission is to repair the ties with Turkey, with recent incidents turning relations into stormy weather between the two countries.
Under pressure. It may not be the easiest visit to Ankara for U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, with relations between Washington and Ankara going through one of their testiest periods in recent memory. Turkey said on Saturday that one of the top items on the agenda for Biden's visit will be Fethullah Gulen, the U.S.-based cleric Erdogan accuses of planning an attempted military coup in July. Turkey's president has demanded that the U.S. extradite exiled Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen, but the U.S. has asked for solid evidence as proof.
On extradition of criminals, if a country wants a criminal in your country to be extradited, you have no right to argue with that. You have to extradite to us, according to Article 9.
In the wake of the failed July 15th coup attempt in Turkey, a NATO member state, Erdogan made it clear he felt let down by the U.S. and other Western countries. Earlier this month, Erdogan shook hands with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow, marking a clear thaw of tensions over Turkey's downing of a Russian jet late last year.
He might be tempted to use this opportunity or to play up the significance of his visit to Moscow in order to have an enhanced hand in dealing with his Western partners.
Biden's visit to Ankara is widely seen as a trip of necessity because of the many issues that still stand unresolved between the two sides. The big question is, will Turkey-U.S. ties survive the storm?
For more on Joseph Biden's visit to Turkey, we are joined in Washington, D.C. by Bülent Alireza, Director and Senior Associate of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Alireza, originally coming from Turkey. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., we are having Mr. David Setney, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security Affairs. Meanwhile, joining us from Brussels, we're having Mr. Peter Klepp, head of the Brussels office of Open Europe. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. The latest news, I'm sure all of you are aware, Turkey have sent tanks and also artillery troops into the border of Syria. Many are wondering what this would mean. Is this going to be a game changer in the overall situation regarding Syria? Let's go to Mr. Alireza first.
I don't think so. I think it's a limited operation, excuse me, primarily against the town of Jarablus, which the IS, Islamic State, has held for at least 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, right on the border. And you know, apparently Jarablus is being evacuated by ISIS, was being evacuated even before the Turkish intervention. Now, where it might become a possible game changer is if the goals of the operation are expanded to include the Kurdish forces who've been allied with the United States. They recently took Manbij. Turkey has said that they need to evacuate the areas west of the Euphrates, as the U.S. has apparently promised Turkey. The U.S. is in a difficult position on this issue, and as your lead-up suggested, there are lots and lots of other problems associated with the post-coup situation. So Biden is no doubt talking about this, as well as all the other aspects that you touched on.
All right. We're not just yet talking about Mr. Biden's trip. Let's focus still on the recent incidents of Turkish troops moving into the Syrian border. Mr. Setney, from your perspective, what would happen Is this only targeting at the ISIS, or this is also targeting at Kurdish forces? Some of those are being supported, or at least allies of the United States.
I agree those are important issues, but more importantly, this is Turkey going into Syria. And I agree with Gulen Ali Riza that's a limited operation, but it will be very interesting to see how long it extends for. Because the real issue here for Turkey is the future of Syria and the future of the Bashar Assad government. And that is an area where, despite the recent meeting between Putin and Erdogan, where Russia and Turkey have had very different long-term strategic objectives. Turkey has been very strong in the idea that you need to get rid of the Bashar Assad government, and has been concerned about the consequences of not doing so. So I think this, I agree this is a limited operation. I think that it could have long-term consequences if Turkish forces stay for a long period of time.
Yeah, what is long period of time according to you, sir?
A long period of time would be 6 months, a year, 2 years.
I see. Having said that, though, let's go to Mr. Klepp. This is happening all at an interesting time. Of course, you're observing from Europe. Europe has expressed its understanding, NATO has expressed its understanding of Turkey to deal with the Kurdish side of its problem. And yet, when you see that Turkish forces coming into the Syria, the country itself, will that further complicate the issue? How much will NATO, will European countries be able to sit there on their hands when Turkey are coming into Syria?
Europe has some understanding for the Turkish position. The Turkish actions clearly are the consequence of the latest terrorist attack, which has been blamed on ISIS. Now, one problem is indeed the fact that almost the whole border with Turkey is now under control of Kurdish forces in Syria, and Joe Biden just said that these Kurdish forces need to withdraw and stay in the east. Now the question is, will they do that? But it's clear that they do not have the support of the United States to stay in certain areas where they are currently staying. So there is some common ground there between the United States and Turkey.
Mr. Shetney, may I also have your opinion about the timing of this so-called sending tanks into Syria by Turkey? This is exactly coincides with the visit of the Vice President, Mr. Joseph Biden, from the United States. He is, by the way, the first Western country leader into the country of Turkey after the coup, which has been accused by some in the West and not necessarily dealt very well by the Turkish president. And this also coincides with not long after the Turkish president visited Moscow and certainly had a great deal of talk with the Russian president. What do you make of this timing? What does that mean when it comes to the cards that Ankara wants to show to Washington?
My reading of the timing is that it's a very clear message from the Turkish government that Turkey will put its own interests first. Turkey has been restrained about going into Syria before for the U.S. to provide air cover and no-fly zone, various other requests to work together. But this time Turkey is clearly acting on its own, defending its own interest, and I think that message goes beyond just this incursion, that Turkey will put its own interest ahead of others.
But things are getting complicated, Mr. Ali Reza, like it or not. We have already heard protests coming from the Syrian government, I mean the Syrian administration and regime at this moment about the Turkish recent movement. So will that lead to further spark between these two countries, and will that also further complicate the already devastating situation?
Well, it was complicated before. It's going to get even more complicated. Now, the Syrian government has formally complained about the Turkish incursion into Syria. Of course, it has no control over that area that Turkey has gone into. So this is a pro forma statement that I don't think one should pay much attention to. Now, more important is the response of the Syrian Kurds. Salih Muslim of the Syrian Kurdish leadership has actually condemned it, and President Erdogan in his speech today responded to Muslims' comment, saying that wait until you see what's going to happen to you. So what we should keep an eye on is this triangular relationship between Ankara, Washington, and the Syrian Kurds. Now, the Syrian Kurds have been an ally of the United States as they moved against ISIS targets in the north, and the new commander of the anti-ISIS operations for the U.S., General Townsend, yesterday commented that the Syrian Kurds were great allies, and he expected to move with them, with U.S. Special Forces assisting them on the ISIS capital of Raqqa. Now, what does this Turkish incursion, which might expand into an assault on the Kurdish forces west of the Euphrates, mean for the Obama administration's goal of defeating ISIS and taking over their capital? Obviously, this is the kind of thing that the U.S. and Turkey will talk about in the days and weeks to come.
Mr. Ali Reza, I want to follow up a little bit because we've also been hearing from the Turkish side responding to the Syrian protest that it is talking about the territorial integration of Syria is going to be extremely important for Turkey. How should we understand this, by the way?
This is a code word for Turkish opposition to the establishment of a Kurdish belt across the Turkish-Syrian border. Most of that area below the Turkish border is controlled by the Kurds. It's only the 96 kilometers, the so-called Manbij Gap, which was not controlled by the Kurds. The Kurdish incursion, backed by the United States, west of the Euphrates, which got them to Manbij, has closed off that area, preventing jihadists from going in and from going out. And that was a prelude to an attack on Raqqa. Now, the Turkish government is saying that it's intervening in order to protect the territorial integrity of Syria. Syria is complaining about this, but it's really the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, and the United States who should be concerned about what exactly it is that Turkey wants to do there.
Right, what exactly Turkey wants to do, and also how does it want to do it? Mr. Setny, one of the things we mentioned earlier is Turkey's recent approach to Moscow, and it seems to be much friendlier than it used to be. Certainly also get certain consent coming from Moscow as well. So, do you think Turkey can play to the United States the double cards? One is approach to Washington ever closer, or approach to Moscow ever closer? How will Washington, at this election season, going to make its choice?
Well, I think there may be some element of that great power politicking that you discussed. I think it has much more to do with the situation in Syria. The Russian ability to act in Syria is something that could endanger Turkey's interest. And if Turkey and Russia have come to some kind of agreement about Turkey's actions, both the current ones and potential future ones, that will give Turkey a much freer hand. Of course, there is this broader geopolitical game playing that you mentioned going on, but I think it's secondary to the immediate tactical interest of Turkey in ensuring Russia does not support the Syrian government's objection to this alleged infringement on Syria's territorial integrity.
Mr. Ali Reza, I want to come back to you. Do you think Ankara can play that card well, or is it going to bring more fire onto its own land?
Very difficult to play this hand in a way that does not offend Turkey's main ally, the United States. I think the Europeans are less important from Ankara's point of view. It's really Washington that the message, the visit to St. Petersburg and the meeting with Putin was addressed to. Now, I agree with David Sadney that there are fundamental differences between Turkey and Russia when it comes to Syria. Turkey wants Assad out, and Moscow, together with Tehran, are the two capitals that have made sure that Assad stays in office. Now, can those differences be bridged? Russian planes have been bombing Turkish opposition-backed groups in Syria, in Idlib province. At some stage, those differences will have to be eradicated. Now, there may be tactical agreements when it comes to the Kurds that Assad, in spite of his statements, might agree to. But frankly, it's too early to tell. And ultimately, Turkey will remain a member of NATO. It will remain an ally of the United States. It will play the Russian card, but without endangering those.
Well, we'll see whether that would happen. But the thing is, Mr. Klepp, what is the most important focus for Turkey now? Is it going to be about Assad, which has been the focus at the very beginning? Or is it going to be of the Kurdish forces, which Turkey has always considered as one of its biggest challenges? So it really depends on which focus they are going to have for the short term in the near future, isn't it, Mr. Clapp?
Turkey is definitely more concerned about the Kurdish forces than about Assad. There's already been noises in the Turkish government to sort of stop saying that Assad must go. This all fits in the grand movement that we're seeing, where there is a rapprochement between Russia and the West, the lifting of the sanctions against Iran. So if all these power players in the Middle East could come together, then it will probably be much more easier to tackle the problem of ISIS.
Having said that, what about Turkey's relations with the rest of NATO and also with the European countries? Turkey, of course, apparently has been shouldering quite some responsibilities when it comes to these immigrants, if I could use the word, or refugees, and also has been playing a role of sitting in between Europe and the rest of the troubled regions. How much does Europe still value Turkey? And what about Turkey's recent moves these days? Will that in any way influence Brussels and the European capitals' thinking and analysis about Ankara?
Well, Turkey is still strategically very important for Europe, but the problem is, I think, that in the past promises have been made that are frankly unsustainable to keep. There is no political consensus in Europe to allow visa-free travel for Turkish people into Europe, for example. There's also very little political support for Turkish EU membership, at least in the next 10 to 15 years. So probably the wisest thing to do is to be more honest with Turkey, to state that European countries definitely want to remain allies, but that doesn't have to mean having Turkey in the European Union. So
Right.
I would not be surprised if in the next few years we will see movement in that direction.
All right, Mr. Sedney, we have to mention this because with the visit of Vice President Biden to Turkey, many have been looking at the possibility of extradite the cleric Gulen. Of course, originally coming from Turkey, also was being considered as an enemy of President Erdogan. What do you think United States might do? Earlier, U.S. was quite reluctant to do that.
Well, the United States is a country of laws and rules, and those laws and rules will be followed. The United States system does not allow the President of the United States to order the immediate extradition of somebody based upon the demand of another country's leader. It has to go through a legal process. The United States in recent days has clearly signaled to Turkey that it wants to work with Turkey on the legal process, dispatching groups from the Department of Justice to Turkey to work with them through the existing mechanisms. But it's not going to be fast. The U.S. system of justice and its appeal process make it more likely than not that this will be a long-standing, continuing area of disagreement as the legal process goes forward. And I really can't predict how the legal process will end up. But I think it's very unlikely to be able to satisfy the Turkish government, the Turkish people, and most of all, Mr. Erdogan.
I see. We got 30 seconds left only, so may I have one sentence only from every one of you helping us to understand what should be the factors that we should watch very closely when it comes to the latest with the nature of Turkey and, of course, of the region. Mr. Ali Reza, one sentence from you, sir.
Well, I think we can predict more surprises and more changes in Turkish foreign policy in the geopolitical picture.
All right. Mr. Clapp.
I would say watch the U.S. presidential election. I think that could be a game changer.
All right. And Mr. Sedney. Yes, Mr. Sedney.
I think the long-term strategic interest of Turkey and the United States in maintaining a very good relationship continue, but there are many minefields ahead.
David Sedney, Bulent Ali Reza, Peter Clapp. We're going to watch, yes, the result of the U.S. presidential election and also many of the other hotspots around the world. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming right up. The chief of Canadian leader Justin Trudeau's office, Katie Telford, gives us a glimpse into the Prime Minister's fresh policies for Canada ahead of his trip to the G20 summit this month in Hangzhou. You're watching World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. The G20 in Hangzhou is approaching in about 10 days. China, as the host country, has great hopes for it to eventually become a launch pad for economies to coordinate and eventually soar. Of course, that's easier said than done. It depends on many factors. One of them is how top state leaders from the G20 economies are going to communicate effectively.
The 2016 G20 summit is expected to be held on September 4th and 5th in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou. World leaders, including Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, will gather to tackle the political and economic challenges facing the world. Trudeau will arrive in China at the end of this month, 43 years after his father became the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China. Trudeau is the second youngest Prime Minister in Canadian history. He won the leadership of the Liberal Party in 2013 and went on to lead his party to victory in the 2015 federal election.
Faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion.
Just days after his inauguration, the Prime Minister arrived in Turkey for the 2015 G20 summit, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two leaders pledged to foster closer relations between the two countries.
As we know, the climax of the annual G20 meeting is really heads of state summit attended by the state leaders of the 20 economies. Canada, as mentioned earlier, is a member of both the G7 and the G20, which is quite special. So how is Ottawa preparing for the G20 summit? Will Canadian and the Chinese leaders have bilateral meetups during the G20 summit? What are likely on the list of topics for discussion? No other person knows the details better than Katie Telford, Chief of Staff to the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. I caught up with her in Beijing recently. Here is the latest that she can share.
My Prime Minister, who will be here in only just a couple of weeks.
We are looking forward to that.
So, as is he and the whole team. And there's lots of activity planning ahead of the G20. So it's very exciting.
Between the Chinese president and also your Prime Minister, they met the second day of Prime Minister Trudeau came into the office at the last G20 summit.
Yes, it was just literally a few days after the swearing-in ceremony, and but it was very exciting. And they did talk about his father and Bethune, and as well as a number of substantive issues that I think will continue. You know, began the various conversations that have been happening with ministers since then, and that have continued between them on a go-forward basis.
What can be some expectation from your side for the upcoming G20?
Obviously, you know, the government and the Prime Minister and Cabinet are looking to deepen ties with China, and so, you know, we're looking to continue that dialogue.
Justin Trudeau unveiled his new cabinet last November, making history for the country in many ways. It was one of the most ethnically diverse cabinets to date, and it is the first to have equal numbers of men and women. Among the 15 women appointed, many were given important portfolios, including Jody Wilson-Raybould to Justice and Carolyn Bennett to Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Apart from gender equity, youth is the other issue that Prime Minister Trudeau cares about deeply. Trudeau's cabinet is younger overall than past Canadian governments. He also appointed himself Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and Youth. Canada has never had a national Ministry of Youth, and historically only junior ministers have been assigned responsibility for youth. Moreover, Trudeau is looking to form a youth council to help shape the future of Canadian policy.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau really is a politician of a totally new generation. He's coming into the office, as we mentioned earlier, had a lot to do with his beliefs into the political potential of the young people. And adding to that, also takes on gender equity, a centerpiece of his administration's policy, going as far as to openly and proudly call himself a feminist. Katie Telford, Chief of Staff to Canadian Prime Minister, explained to me in detail how youth development and gender equity are setting the latest trend in politics in her country, Canada. We do not know much about how a Prime Minister's office is being run. We only heard it or saw it from The West Wing, for example, the TV series, or The House of Cards. So exactly how does that work?
So not like the House of Cards. More on the West Wing spectrum between those two. Myself as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, and our Prime Minister in particular, committed to having a cabinet government. So we have ministers who are elected, he then appoints them as ministers, and they have a lot of authority. So we as staff play a role of coordination, of prioritization, but really of being support to all of them, to the cabinet and to the Prime Minister.
Some were suggesting the current structure of the Prime Minister's office is a legacy, continued legacy of the last Prime Minister Trudeau back in 1968. More oversight of the ministers and more services to the overall bureaucracy structure. Do you agree?
So I was definitely not there under Trudeau Sr., but we interestingly stumbled across, actually one of the public servants shared with us a document that they found from I think it was probably from the early 70s. I think there are certainly similarities, though it's always been a bit shrouded how the staff part of the organization works. It's one of the things that I have been looking, and my team has been looking to change, because I believe that the way that we can engage more young people, bring more women into the Prime Minister's office, bring more diversity into the Prime Minister's office, the best way to do that is to be more open about who's there and what we do.
But no change would come without challenges. I'm sure when you started those ideas, try to implement those ideas, there will be different opposition voices.
That is very true. And
the long sigh seemed to tell the story already.
Having said that, we have only been in, as we remind ourselves regularly, we are only just actually within this last week celebrating, if you can call it that, 1 year since the beginning of what was one of the longest elections in Canadian history. And so we have not even been elected for a year yet. So we're just at the beginning of our mandate with a lot more to do. It is a challenge, though. I think we have developed such a great dynamic as a team from early times. You know, I was involved during the campaign. Obviously, I was the campaign director, and so I have watched all of these politicians grow in their roles from the first times many of them knocked on doors. We have a lot of rookie politicians and rookie cabinet ministers, and we have some with great experience as well. And so we all know each other well enough that I think we're able to find our way through the challenges so far.
Talking about the campaign, I was told you are extremely good at numbers. You want all your members in the campaign to come up with numbers every time they see you. How did that work?
So I definitely gained a reputation for numbers and for talking about numbers a lot.
The queen of numbers.
And I did that right from the very beginning, because we were determined as a campaign team to be much more results-based and data-driven. Numbers don't lie, and they tell a story, and a story that is easier to explain to people when you can root them in those facts, in those numbers. And so we collected a lot of data, because we had a lot of learning to do as a party too. We were in third place, and a distant third place, and we had been through a couple of very rough elections, and had a bit of a crisis as a party. And so we knew we really had to rediscover ourselves and our connection with Canadians, which meant we had a lot to learn. And so the best way we believed to learn was through collecting information that could best inform us.
Which number eventually get Mr. Trudeau into the office?
No one number, actually. No one number. Actually, what I do say my favorite number is. So I wouldn't say it was the one number that got us into office, but there's a reason it's my favorite, because I think it was key to getting him into office. We tracked the number of volunteers that we engaged across the country. And by the time the campaign hit, we had over 80,000 volunteers, which in a country the size of Canada is a very big number. And so having that number of over 80,000 volunteers, we also tracked the number of door knocks and phone calls that were made to voters to talk to them.
5 million for the first week
yeah,
during the party leadership?
We did pretty well. So
It's amazing.
Those
5
were the
million.
kinds of numbers that meant the most to me because they told me how much work was being done.
But
And
how did those numbers come into being? That is the amazing thing. I mean, 5 million for the week.
a lot of hard work. A lot of hard work. What we did see was that it took us a very long time to achieve those numbers if you look back to the beginning of our training program. So we didn't hide these numbers. We put out news bulletins kind of to our team and talked about them with the media because it was part of convincing Canadians too about the work that we were going to do and how we were going to get into those communities and that these candidates were going to knock on doors and get to know every inch of their community.
It's amazing how you geared up the young people as volunteers because when you look at politics elsewhere, many young people become disillusioned about politics. They become indifferent to politics.
Not just young people anymore, unfortunately, but especially young people, it's true.
We have to say that, yes, indeed. What took you eventually to convince them to be on board?
First of all, the Prime Minister was essential to the connection with young people. As you may know, the Prime Minister hung on to a ministerial portfolio, and he is not only the Prime Minister, he is the Minister of Youth. And so he continues to keep that connection with young people because it's that important to him. And he had a background in working with young people and in the nonprofit sector. He was a teacher and so had literally worked in the classroom with young people. And so he brought that to bear from the very beginning of our thinking on the campaign of how we were going to engage young people. And it was a bit of a risk in some people's minds to put the focus on young people that we did, because in Canada young people don't vote in the same kind of numbers that seniors and older people do, unless you got more of them to vote. So the Prime Minister was key in terms of both putting it as a priority and in terms of the message and talking to young people. And then those numbers came in handy again, where we tracked everything. And so after his leadership campaign, we were able to look at the numbers and see young people didn't want to sign up to a political party, but they would give us their time if they didn't have to sign up first. And so they would come and volunteer on the leadership campaign. They'd sometimes even give us money, to my utter surprise, before they would sign up. Well, right now the Prime Minister, with his Minister of Youth hat on, actually he just launched a process within the country to, or a competition for young people to sign up and apply to be part of a youth advisory council, a Prime Minister's Youth Advisory Council. So he is keeping the priority there big time, shall we say.
I'm sure there will be a lot of debates within that council.
I suspect so. I have a lot of people tweeting at me and telling me, you know, that they have applied that I've not met before, but it's very exciting to see the level of engagement out there. And I've been talking to some of the youth from other countries that are at the summit here about checking out what it is that the Prime Minister is doing in Canada. And this is something I've heard him say many times to young people for many years, is they aren't leaders of tomorrow, they are leaders today.
Prime Minister Trudeau has made it to the centerpiece of the administration's policy, gender equity. But I think from your personal story even, that means some challenge. During the election, you were questioned by many, particularly those long-time followers of the party, whether you are up to the job, whether you are capable enough, whether you are mature enough, and whether women is okay with that.
Yeah, there was some of that.
To say the least, I know, now you're retrospect.
Yeah, well, and there were challenges even dating further back, not just with critics, but in terms of just how to manage it all myself. When the Prime Minister, the then MP for Papineau, which he still is, the Member of Parliament for Papineau, when he approached me to get involved, he said he was thinking about the leadership, and if he were to do that, would I consider running his leadership campaign? And I remember looking at him and saying, you know, you realize that I'm on maternity leave. But I have been, I now have, so I was on maternity leave then, and I now have a wonderful, just turned 5-year-old son. And so, but we all had that. And key really to our team from the very beginning, whether it was Jerry Betts, the Principal Secretary I mentioned, whether it's the Prime Minister or myself, and the broader team, a lot of us have young kids. We have cabinet ministers. There's been a lot of news stories about how different cabinet ministers are managing work-life balance. One of them turns off her BlackBerry for a couple of hours every evening, and that's the experiment she's trying to make it all work with her young kids at home. In terms of the critics who are sort of the ones who weren't sure either because of age or gender or whatever the difference, I was privileged to have a leader who pretty much told us to ignore that noise.
You were at the time have to leave Toronto. That's where your home was.
I just moved to Ottawa this past January.
During the campaign also.
Oh yeah, no, I was away from
to
my
leave
family,
your
yeah.
little child back at home. And also your husband, even now when you come into the Prime Minister's office, he has to quit his job as a political commentator because of...
He did. He didn't have to, but he chose to.
He chose to.
And,
so,
yeah.
so it seems that there has to be a lot of changes within the family.
Yeah.
How are you coping with that? And how have they been coping with that?
So I obviously am very fortunate to have the family that I have, who have been so incredibly supportive from the very beginning. We are more, I think, flexible perhaps. I think it's the changing times in a way that, you know, I bring my son to, I brought him along to many a campaign event in the leadership
Really?
campaign in Toronto. He found rallies very noisy. And he didn't fully understand. So one of the things, actually a tweet that people raised with me to this day, that my husband actually posted to social media during the campaign and then I reposted, was how my son asked my husband at one point during the campaign if daddies were allowed to vote.
Oh.
And
where does that question come from?
My husband said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, because mummies run elections. And so he was a bit younger even at the time. So he is definitely a more civic-minded, I think, you know, 3, 4, 5-year-old
Another gender stereotypes, I guess.
But, yes, he's getting a different one, which is why it got so much attention, is because, you know, hopefully we're opening doors and minds to people realizing that, you know, shoe may be on other foot, but these are challenges that young and working parents have all the time.
But what do you make from a women leader's perspective of the recent rise of women leaders all over the world? You've seen prime ministers, presidents of what we call, quote-unquote, important countries, decision-making countries in the international system. And you also see rising up the young women leaderships around the world as well.
One of the ways that I think it will be, though, is if women keep, to your point, leaning in. But I actually, you know, the campaign that I really like that Lean In is doing, that recently launched, is Lean In Together. And I think that, and that's to both men and women, that they need to be supporting, they need to be supporting women rising and not seeing it as either a competition with each other or as a threat to men. And I think that support is key, and I hope that our cabinet, I hope that, you know, me and my role and my collaboration with my colleagues and with the Prime Minister, that this can open some minds and doors. The research out there is proving true that having that many women around the table really does make a difference. It's been less than a year, and so Canadians haven't yet all heard their stories. I mean, it takes a while for the stories to get through, because there are some pretty phenomenal stories and backgrounds, and these ministers are doing phenomenal work and working so hard that I don't see how Canadians won't see the change. It just may take some time.
And of course, the Prime Minister can be very charismatic. We all saw that photo, very popular on social media. He was doing push-up on the tables in the office. Of course, that was before he became Prime Minister. But still, it was really refreshing to many around the world. How would you describe that person, Prime Minister Trudeau?
He works really, really hard. He is a very disciplined individual in terms of his focus on work and his focus on connecting with Canadians. So whether it's pushing us to think of different ways of doing town halls, and he much prefers doing a town hall where he gets to have questions and answers with people in the audience than to only do a speech and then have to leave. He loves to plunge into a crowd, and you know, which is a bit different as Prime Minister, but he still does it. And it's that connection with Canadians, while at the same time that discipline of ensuring that the whole team, you know, understands the priorities.
That is, of course, Ms. Katie Telford, Chief of Staff to the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Both of them very strong-minded people. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across the world and certainly here in China. Good night.